Hi, I'm Dan Heber, and this is the lecture video to accompany the material on John Searle and Daniel Dennett. And normally in these videos I'm covering the reading assignment, but in this case there isn't a reading assignment. I had asked you to watch this video here, about 28 minutes long, by a guy by the name of Jeffrey Kaplan, who was actually a student of John Searle's, and so he's in a very good position to talk about John Searle's famous thought experiment called the Chinese Room. And the other assignment for today, I don't know what happened there. Oh, there we go. And the other thing that I had asked you, the other resource I had asked you to listen to in preparation for this material was an audio interview with Daniel Dennett, in which he's offering a criticism of John Searle's account of John Searle's famous thought experiment. But before we get into either of those, I want to talk a little bit about where we are at this point and where we left off in the previous video. In the previous video, we were talking about Jerry Fodor and the theory of functionalism. And the article we were looking at from Jerry Fodor was from this 1981 Scientific American magazine. But the idea of functionalism had already been around for more than 30 years at that point. The idea of functionalism actually comes from a mathematician slash philosopher, a guy by the name of Alan Turing, who was such a notable figure in history that Benedict Cumberbatch played him in the movie The Imitation Game. That's probably about 8 to 10 years old at this point. And in the Imitation Game, the title of the paper was Computing Machinery and Intelligence, which was published in a very influential philosophical journal called Mind in 1950. So in that paper, Alan Turing, who, as an aside, is widely regarded as the inventor of an entire, field, the field of computing and computer information systems more generally. And in this article here, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, Alan Turing basically invented the theory of functionalism. So remember what we said last time. From the functionalist perspective, something has a mind if it functions in the world the way an entity in the world would function. So that brings up this question of well, how do we know whether something is functioning in the world the way that something with a mind would function? And so Turing proposed this imitation game, and if you want to read this, if you have an interest in computer science, this is a fascinating paper to read. I didn't assign it because it's 22 pages long and it's quite a difficult read, but those with the background in logic, mathematics, or computer science would really enjoy this article here, and it's easily findable. There's all kinds of PDF versions of this online just by typing in the name Turing and the title of the paper. So the imitation game. The imitation game has come to be known as the Turing test. Alan Turing was not so narcissistic that he named it after himself. He called it the imitation game. Since his time, though, it has been referred to as the Turing test. And basically, the Turing test is a test that we can use to determine, it's a postulated test that we can use to determine whether or not something has mind. And so here's a graphic representation of how the Turing test would work. Alan Turing in 1950 was basically talking about AI, artificial intelligence. And he was talking about, communicating with an entity. And the idea is you don't know whether you are communicating with a human being or whether you're communicating with a machine. And the idea is that if you can't tell, if you engage in several interactions with that entity, and if you can't tell whether you're communicating with a machine or whether you're communicating with a human being, then you have to conclude on pain of inconsistency that the entity that you're in communication with possesses mind. Again, for the same reason you say that I have mind and mental states, because I'm functioning in the world the way that a person with a mind and mental states would function. So on this graphic representation, you have the human questioner. And that human questioner is engaged in correspondence. One of them is a human respondent, one of them is a computer respondent. And these lines here represent that the human questioner doesn't know which is which. So again, the idea there is like, if you can't tell which one's the human and which one's the computer, then you have to say that the computer has mind or mental states. And there's been entire movies dedicated to this notion. I already mentioned The Imitation Game. That was the most obvious one. But there's another science fiction film called not that An Imitation Game is science fiction. There is a science fiction film called Ex Machina, which the entirety of the movie is about the Turing test. Very, very good film. But that is the position of the functionalist. Again, if you can't tell, then you have to say that the entity in question has mind. And to give another example, think of something like the game of chess. Think of if you are this person and if you're playing a computer in the game of chess, ask yourself the question, it's like, well, does it make sense to say that the computer knows how to play chess? Now keep in mind, for someone like Descartes, remember, to know something, to believe something, to hope something, to will something, all of those are examples of mental states. So to know something means that you are in this mental state of possessing knowledge, according to a dualist such as Descartes. Now remember, what the functionalist is doing is wanting to remove the question of mind from the ontological realm and put it in the epistemological realm. So how could you know that I understood and knew how to play the game of chess? Well, obviously, you would just sit down at a chess table with me, and you would play a game of chess with me. And if I were making the moves that a person who understood how to play the game of chess would move, well, then you're going to say, well, I know that Dan knows how to play chess. And how do you know that? Well, you know it on the basis of what you are experiencing. And what you are experiencing is an entity who is functioning the way that an entity who understands and knows the game of chess would function. So from the functionalist account, it makes perfect sense to say that a computer knows how to play the game of chess. And you know that the same way that you would know that I know how to play the game of chess, on the basis of how they're functioning. I function in the world the way a person who understands the game of chess would function, and so is the computer. Now notice that Descartes' going to say, he's committed to saying, he has to say that the computer doesn't have knowledge at all, because knowledge for Descartes is a mental state. And remember that computers do not possess cognition. They do not possess mentality. They don't know anything. What Descartes would say is that all the computer is doing is kicking out moves in blind response to this programmed input. It's simply following an algorithm. So there's no thought that's taking place there. It's just sort of mechanistically going through these perturbations and responding in accordance to some coding. So that is where we're going to be entering into a discussion of John Searle. So now let me go back to this tab right here. And remember, Jeffrey Kaplan, I've mentioned this in passing before, I think only in writing though, that Jeffrey Kaplan in his videos, he's not writing backwards. He is writing the way anybody else writes. He's being recorded from the opposite side of a piece of glass called a whiteboard, and there's these special markers so that the light board has this light that is in the interior of the panel that is designed to pick up the ink of these special markers. And so he's on one side of the light board. There's a camera on the other side of the light board, and then they record him writing everything down on that. And then in post-production, they'll just flip it. So if you'll notice, Jeffrey Kaplan's wearing a watch. The watch, you'll see it's on his right arm, or it looks like it's on his right arm. It's not on his right arm. It's on his left arm. He does not write backwards. He writes the same way everyone else does. So please don't be distracted by that whenever you're watching that video. So John Searle wants to give a criticism of the functionalist account. And what John Searle is going to say, that the primary difference between a computer, what a computer is doing, and what a human being is doing, is that the computer is operating at the level of syntax, programming code, whereas a human being is operating at the level of semantics. So what we mean by semantics, the difference between semantics versus syntax. Syntax is just the logical rules, the grammar, if you will. Semantics is the meaning. So notice that we can utter a sentence in English that obeys every single grammatical rule. For example, the sentence, "Colorless green ideas sleep furiously." That sentence that I just uttered is perfectly syntactically correct. It does not violate a single rule of grammar, and yet it's nonsense, right? It's meaningless. The sentence, "Colorless green ideas sleep furiously," has no meaning, right? It has no semantic content. It obeys this logical syntax. It obeys the rules of grammar, and it is utterly meaningless. So that is what John Searle is going to do. That is his technique, and going to be that's the technique he's going to use in offering a criticism of the theory of functionalism. And so what John Searle does is come up with this example titled "The Chinese Room." And notice that the Chinese room is just a different version of what Turing called the imitation game, right? This notion that you're just sitting there and you're trying to figure out whether you're communicating with a human being or whether you're communicating with a robot. But on Searle's argument, there's a person that we're told does not speak Chinese, does not understand the Chinese language. And they're in this room. And along in that room with them are a bunch of codes, there's a bunch of scripts, there's a bunch of handbooks that tell you how to translate words. So on the outside of the Chinese room, there is this person who does understand Chinese. And they write down a question in Chinese, and they put it in this little slot in the door or the wall. And now the person in the room who does not understand Chinese but has access to all these translation manuals sits down with this question written in a language they don't understand, and with all of these rule books that to assist them in translating, sits down and goes sort of line by line, code by code, and writes down a response to the question, and then kicks it out. So remember what the functionalist is doing, is that the functionalist is wanting to understand mind in terms of input and output. And what Searle is going to say is that, well, from the perspective of the person outside the Chinese room, it looks like the person on the inside of the Chinese room understands Chinese. And why does it look like they understand Chinese? Well, because input and output. I put in a question and I get a response out of the other side of it, right? The person's functioning the way that a person who understands the Chinese language would function. But what Searle is going to say is that that's just the syntax. If all this person here is doing is consulting this code that is telling them what to do, then they're obeying logical syntax, but they completely lack a semantic framework. They don't possess an understanding of what it is. And so going back to the chess example, did I already close that? Oh no, there it is. Going back to the chess example, what Searle is going to say is that computers don't understand the game of chess, right? A functionalist, somebody like Alan Turing, somebody like Jerry Fodor is going to say, well, yes, of course, a computer understands the game of chess. And how do you know it understands the game of chess? Well, the same way that you know that I understand the game of chess, right? You sit down and you play a game with me, and you see that I function in that environment the way that an entity who understands the game of chess would function. What Searle is going to say is, no. Just like the person in the Chinese room.
That's all by definition.
Clicked it. Just as the person in the Chinese room does not understand Chinese, but just sort of functions the way a person who understands Chinese would function, well, so too the computer doesn't actually understand the game of chess. The computer doesn't know how to play the game of chess. The computer, again, is just sort of blindly kicking out moves on the basis of this algorithm that has been programmed into it. So there is no understanding at the semantic level, right? There's a movement that is the result of a program, but there's no understanding of what that move means. What Searle is going to say is that the computer doesn't know what it means to have your queen in jeopardy. It will respond as a result of you putting its queen in jeopardy, but the response is dictated by a code. That's just the syntax. It doesn't understand why it's doing what it's doing. It's just kicking out that code. So that is, again, I'm going over this very, very quickly. Please do refer to the entire video by Jeffrey Kaplan there for the full explanation there. That's what John Searle is going to say about what computers are doing. And John Searle makes this distinction between weak AI and strong AI. The distinction is this: weak AI is simply mimicking actual intelligence. That's what Searle says is going on with this. What Searle is going to say is that the computer is just mimicking an understanding of chess, but it doesn't possess it, right? It's doing the things that an entity who understands chess would do, but it lacks the semantic understanding of those moves. Again, the moves are just programmed outputs. And there is a difference between understanding semantics and programmed output syntax. So with that distinction between weak AI and strong AI, weak AI is just acting like you have intelligence, behaving as if you have intelligence. Strong AI is actually in full possession of intelligence. There's a, let's see what this means here. I mean, from my meme page, functionalism exists, Searle, the ability to speak doesn't make you intelligent, right? Just because you're speaking, just because you're functioning, and of course that's exactly what the person in the Chinese room is doing, right? The person in the Chinese room is functioning the way that a person who understands Chinese would function, right? But what Searle's going to say is that this person in the room right there doesn't possess understanding. That person is just following a series of rules. That person only has the syntax. They don't have the semantics. So therefore, in any sort of digital computing scenario, and again, that phrase, what we mean by that is fully outlined in that video by Jeffrey Kaplan, so I'm going to refer you to that. Anytime we're dealing with a digital computing scenario, what Searle's going to say, we don't have intelligence, we don't have understanding. It doesn't make any sense to say that the computer knows anything. It's just behaving a certain way as dictated by these lines of code. Now, What Dennett is going to say is that Fodor was, that Searle rather was wrong. What Dennett is going to say is that what Searle is doing is sort of stacking the deck in his own favor. And what we mean by that, or what I mean by that rather, go back to the example itself. What is John Searle's first step in his argument? Well, the first step in his argument is to tell us that this person here does not understand Chinese. And then on the basis of that, what does John Searle conclude? Well, John Searle concludes that this person here does not understand Chinese. And so Daniel Dennett kind of throws up his hands and says, well, wait a second here. You're baiting us. You are completely stacking the deck in your own favor. You act like you're presenting us with an argument, but it's not an argument. What you're really saying is that this person does not understand Chinese, therefore that person does not understand Chinese. And what Daniel Dennett questions is that, well, why should we think that this person in this room doesn't understand Chinese? If this person is truly able to function in the world the way a person who functions, the way a person who understands Chinese would function, then why wouldn't you say that this person understands Chinese, right? How do you know that I understand the English language? Well, it just seems obvious, doesn't it? Because I'm functioning in the world the way a person who understands the English language would function. That's it, according to Dennett. Now, Dennett, just as a side note here, Dennett does not identify as a functionalist. But everything he says is completely in line with the theory of functionalism. Dennett identifies as a hetero, as following the hetero-phenomenological method. He sort of obstinately refuses to apply the word functionalist to himself. Everyone else recognizes that he is very clearly a functionalist, and he's offering a defense of the functionalist program. So going back to the criticism again, what Searle is going to say is that the input as output is the same, but from the interior perspective, we have a difference. And what Dennett is going to say is that if this person there were actually functioning in real time the way that a person who understands the Chinese language if you were functioning in real time the way that a person who understands in real time the way the understanding of the English language, the Chinese language, I'm stepping over my words here, then of course it makes perfect sense to say that this person here actually possesses an understanding of the Chinese language. And he basically says Searle is offering us a defective, inept thought experiment that doesn't actually demonstrate what he thinks that he is demonstrating. So again, I'm going to refer you back to these external resources. Please make sure that you read the entirety, that you listen to the entirety of this interview, because I was just sort of sketching over the main points there. Please do listen to what Daniel Dennett has to say for himself. And also please watch all 28 minutes of this video. This video does start, the Kaplan video does give a brief overview of some theories that we have discussed, such as behaviorism and dualism. It briefly mentions this other theory that we didn't discuss, the identity theory, but he doesn't spend a whole lot of time talking about that, and Jeffrey Kaplan, gets right into a discussion of functionalism, which is John Searle's stalking horse, and the primary argument that he uses against it. So, with all those things being said, I'm going to go ahead and bring this video to a close. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.